My name is Gary Kars. I'm the publisher of InvestorHome.com and the author of the new book, The Peaceful Investor. I've been digging through my library, and in this video I'm going to be talking about what I consider to be the best all-around investment books. So these are 5 that I recommend the most, depending on your investment experience and your academic level. One of these should be highly informative for you and save you time and money. Okay, so historically, if you're going to talk about the best investment books and make a list, you have to talk about The Intelligent Investor, and I'm going to start there as well. Intelligent Investor was originally published in 1949 by legendary investment professor Benjamin Graham. He was also known as the Dean of Wall Street, and it's an appropriate start in part because Warren Buffett described it as the best book about investing ever written in earlier editions. At least this was the first edition that I read. In 2003, they released a revised edition of The Intelligent Investor. Jason Zweig was chosen as the editor, and Zweig added significant commentary outside of the original text. Now, Zweig is the author of several other books. Your Money in Your Brain is about behavioral finance, and I have Thinking Fast and Slow from Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman out because if you look at the acknowledgments, he discusses Zweig's role in that book as well.
Acknowledgements are in a very small typeface in the book, so I switched over here to a screen capture, and I'm going to use this as an opportunity to since I'm big on transparency, make a few disclosures. So in the late 1990s, when I created InvestorHome.com, Amazon came out with their associates program, and I signed up and wrote a bunch of book reviews because that's a way to get some revenue. If you buy from Amazon and you link through my website, then I get a commission. So if you're going to buy any of these books or anything else, I'd appreciate if you could link through because I get a commission on qualifying purchases.
So for transparency also, I have history with a lot of these authors. Now during my career publishing, working with institutional investors and working with individual investors, I specifically set out to interact with a lot of these authors, which is why I have a lot of history with some of them. And it's because they're the best at what they do. That's why I went out to interact with these people. Regarding Intelligent Investor, I had read the 4th revised edition, but I was in my old boss, Wayne Wagner's office one day, probably around 15 years ago, and he had a copy of the 2003 revised edition. And frankly, I was very pleasantly surprised as I browsed it, and when I discovered that Zweig had included 2 footnotes citing my website, Investor Home, first regarding mutual fund performance, and second regarding my comments about the Motley Fool's Foolish Four. So I have this out because I was particularly skeptical about the Foolish Four, and I wrote some about that, and then I investigated their real money portfolios. The Gardners are very entertaining. They seem like good people, but I was a skeptic, and I passed that on to Stephen Thorley and Grant McQueen, who later wrote a paper about data mining called Mining Fool's Gold. And William Bernstein, who's also written some excellent books, including the Investor's Manifesto, actually wrote an article on Morningstar talking about the history of that paper. And I'll just also add quickly that Ben Graham is credited with originating the idea for the certification process for financial analysts, which would later manifest in the CFA program. After you take if you complete the CFA program, complete the 3 years of 6-hour exams, you get a diploma like that, although you have to frame it yourself. It's not cheap. So wrapping up The Intelligent Investor, it's reportedly sold over 1 million copies. It's an excellent guide to value investing and fundamental analysis. And I in particular appreciate that it begins with a discussion of investment versus speculation, which I also write about extensively, and I think it's one of the most misinterpreted and misunderstood distinctions among investors and in the investment community. But overall, The Intelligent Investor is a must-read if you work in the investment industry, but it's also readable for novices and those early in their investment education. Downshifting just a bit, the second investment book I recommend is a book specifically geared for beginners and novices, and it's Investing for Dummies. The Dummies brand has been extremely successful. If you're not familiar with Eric Tyson, he is one of the best-selling financial authors of our time. 5 national bestsellers, 4 books on the Business Week bestseller list at one time. And I know that Personal Finance for Dummies, one of his other books, had sold over 2 million copies. It's just that book by 2016, I believe. I've known Eric for decades. He's cited me in my website. He's also asked me to do technical reviews on some of the For Dummies books, including Investing for Dummies, Mutual Funds for Dummies. This was for investing in your 20s and 30s for dummies. But regardless of the relationship, Investing for Dummies is in its 8th edition now. I continue to recommend it. Tyson's an excellent writer. He has an engaging style. He summarizes even complex topics in a way that makes them understandable. So for beginners, Investing for Dummies is a great option. The third investing book I recommend is Common Sense on Mutual Funds from the late Jack Bogle. I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Bogle. In fact, he signed my copy when I met him. The 10th anniversary edition was published in 2009, and Bogle also wrote many other excellent books, including Enough, The Little Book of Common Sense Investing, 2 that I have here. But Common Sense is the best known. It's deep, useful, it's a great resource. I've also written extensively about Bogle's legacy and the remarkable impact that Bogle had on the investment industry, both in the Peaceful Investor on my website and on this page where I collected and linked to over 100 tributes to Bogle from early 2019. In an industry that's rife with conflict of interest, Bogle and Vanguard have succeeded by putting customers first. And his books are certainly one of the best things you can read, and I recommend highly. My fourth recommendation, and a very strong contender for the best investment book, is Stocks for the Long Run from Jeremy Siegel. I had read the second edition, and I had read that he was coming out with some commentary on the global financial crisis, which I've written a lot about. So I bought the 5th edition as well. I met him probably 5 years ago at a Los Angeles CFA presentation. The book is a crossover between a textbook for students of finance and a mass market investing guide. So his focus obviously is on the advantages of stocks. I summarize in the Peaceful Investor some of the precedents that he builds off of from the University of Chicago's work in the 1960s and Ibbotson Associates. Siegel built off that data to, in effect, argue that stocks have much better returns than bonds, gold, and other investments. He also mentions the work of Dimson, Marsh, and Staunton. They separately update their work through Credit Suisse, and they update it every year. You can find it on the Credit Suisse website. If you look at the web page accompanying this video, I have all the links for all this. Since they update their data every year, I think they steal a little bit of the thunder, and it's a great resource from Dimson, Marsh, and Staunton. Now, there's some debates, obviously, about the implications of the data, whether the U.S. is so unique and whether the data is applicable to current times. I've written in the Peaceful Investor a little bit more thoroughly about REITs and real estate, which Siegel discusses very briefly. But regardless, Stocks for the Long Run is an outstanding resource and reference on a broad range of topics in finance. And finally, my personal choice for best overall investment book is A Random Walk Down Wall Street by Burton Malkiel. So Random Walk is a classic investment guide, over 1.5 million copies sold, 12 editions. Shortly after I became licensed as a stockbroker in 1987, I was still in college at the time, I read Random Walk, and it led me to question a lot of what I was seeing in the industry. Now, the focus of a Random Walk is the Random Walk theory and the efficient market hypothesis. Those are foreign to some people and some novices, but Malkiel explains them and their implications in a very readable and understandable style. There's a podcast earlier this year with Tim Ranzetta. He interviewed Malkiel about the first edition in 1973, and Malkiel had actually called for index funds. And although Bogle, really I give credit for being the most important investment professional, Malkiel had called for a lot of what later transpired. He was on the Vanguard board for 28 years, and he also inspired the Wall Street Journal's dartboard contest, given his suggestion that monkeys throwing darts at the Wall Street Journal could pick stocks just as well as so-called professionals. So Malkiel and Bogle were way ahead of their time. They've been proven to be correct in many ways. I'm a little bit more tolerant of the few cases of technical analysis that may have some merit than Malkiel. I haven't met Professor Malkiel in person, but I started emailing him decades ago. By the way, in that podcast, which you can find a link to or you can search for, he mentions the next revolution is going to be in financial advice, which I very much agree with. Financial advice is too expensive. It's often conflicted. So we're very much in tune in terms of what we see happening going forward. Ultimately, I think it's the best investment book overall because he discusses the entire investment process, asset allocation, the major asset classes, portfolio theory, and other topics. It's extremely thorough. He keeps it current. So in my mind, it's the best overall investment book. So those are my top 5 overall investing books. There are obviously a lot of other books that I recommend, some of them not particularly focused on investing, but still worthwhile. For instance, Against the Gods is one of my favorite books. I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Bernstein in 1997 after he had published this book. The Millionaire Next Door and The Richest Man in Babylon are excellent books for reading about lifestyle and savings. And there are a whole host of other books that I recommend, but this video is obviously way too long already.
The investment world has changed a lot since Ben Graham first wrote The Intelligent Investor in 1949. Back then, there were no index funds, no REITs, no ETFs. The idea of the internet, the concepts of investing directly on a computer with a few clicks, or getting advice and collaborating live via video conferencing from virtually anywhere on the earth, and robo-advisors would have been probably hard to imagine or foreign for most. A lot of what Graham and others wrote about in the markets and investing practice is just as relevant today, if not more so in some cases. But in many ways, it's a different world. I've been fortunate to be an observer and sometimes active participant in the evolution of investing theory and practice over the last 30 years. The Peaceful Investor is really my humble attempt to summarize the critical lessons of the investment books, the best investment books and academic research, and integrate how investors can use the new investment services and tools that have evolved, plus the lessons of behavioral finance.